is Haley Cortez, and my group and I decided to do our presentation on the freedom of speech and the press. The freedom of speech is a part of the First Amendment, which states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for an address of grievance. This basically means people are free to express their thoughts and opinions without fearing the punishment of the government. Our presentation will focus on the purpose of the First Amendment and its limitations, examples of freedom of speech and some exceptions, how freedom of speech is relevant today, and the relevant legislation and executive orders. Since 1791, freedom of speech has changed our ability to speak up without the government prohibiting us to do so. Throughout history, we have learned about many injustices and corruptions that have happened across the nation and the changes in legislation to try and correct them. Today, we have many people using their freedom of speech and First Amendment rights in many different movements. More recently, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, which started so many protests all around the United States. This organization has been running since 2013, but has become more known because of the recent passings of people like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We also have the Me Too movement, which women spoke out about being sexually harassed. This movement led so many women to gain the courage to speak up against the privileged people who did these horrible things to them, in which some of these people ended up getting arrested. Another example we have of people using their freedom of speech is the social movement of the LGBTQ+ community. We have people speaking out about their experiences about coming out and the hardships they have had to face, one including that same-sex marriage became legal only 5 years ago in 2015. We have many people speaking up and coming together to fight the corruption there is in the U.S. and using their First Amendment rights and freedom of speech for the better.
Hi, my name is Brenda, and today I will be talking about the constitutional provisions of freedom of speech and the press. So to start off, freedom of speech protects people from all government agencies, such as federal, state, and local, as well as officials such as legislative, executive, and judicial. Freedom of speech and the press applies to symbolic speech as well. For example, flag burning or wearing armbands. Freedom of speech does not protect people against private individuals or organizations, for example, private employers, private landowners, or private colleges. The government can restrict the First Amendment from its people if it's a low demanding standard, for example, defamation, which are false statements damaging a person's reputation, true threats, which are threats to commit a crime, or obscenity, which are highly sexually explicit pornography. It also restricts the First Amendment if it's a less demanding standard, for example, if a person is in a relationship with the government, or if the topic does not regard the content or message of the speech. Freedom of speech and the press covers talking, writing, and printing, as well as broadcasting using the internet and other forms of expression. Today, the First Amendment protects its citizens even more than it previously had done so in history. Thank you.
Hello, this is Dandini. I'm going to be talking about the freedom of speech regarding Supreme Court decisions. And since we acknowledge the fact that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, the following are some examples of speech, both direct and symbolic, that the court has decided are entitled to First Amendment protections. In December 1965, a group of students in Des Moines held a meeting to plan a public showing of their support for peace in the Vietnam War. The principals of the school found out and created a policy that stated that any student wearing an armband would be asked to remove it. As a result, the students sued the school district for violating the students' right of expression and won 7-2 of the court's decision. The Supreme Court held that the armbands represented pure speech that is entirely separate from the actions or conduct of those participating in it. The court also held that students did not lose their First Amendment rights to freedom of speech when they stepped onto school property. A 19-year-old department store worker expressed his opposition to the Vietnam War by wearing a jacket showing the words, "F the draft, stop the war." The young man, Paul Cohen, was charged, found guilty, and was sentenced to 30 days in jail. However, the court reasoned that the expletive, while provocative, was not directed towards anyone. Besides, there was no evidence that people in substantial numbers would be provoked into some kind of physical action by the words on his jacket. For that, Cohen won the court's decision by 5-4. In 1984, in front of the Dallas City Hall, Gregory Lee Johnson burned an American flag as a means of protest against Reagan administration policies. He was later tried and convicted under a Texas law outlawing flag damage. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail and assessed a $2,000 fine. Eventually, the case went to the Supreme Court. In a 5-4 decision, the court held that Johnson's burning of the flag was protected expression under the First Amendment. The court found that Johnson's actions fell into the category of expressive conduct and had a distinctively political nature. And finally, a leader in Ku Klux Klan made a speech at a Klan rally and was later convicted under the law that made illegal advocating crime, sabotage, violence, or unlawful methods of terrorism as a means of accomplishing industrial or political reform. Yet, the court held that Ohio law violated Brandenburg's right to free speech for 2 reasons. Number 1, speech can be prohibited if it is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and 2, it is likely to incite or produce such action. That was my time. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kaylee Robinson, and I am going to finish off the presentation by going over legislation and executive orders regarding freedom of speech and press. First, I'm going to talk about some of the tests freedom of speech has had, which include the Sedition Act of 1798. The legislation passed this act in which it permitted the deportation, fines, or imprisonment of anyone deemed a threat for publishing false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government of the United States. Another one was the Espionage Act, which essentially made it a crime for any person to convey information intended to interfere with the U.S. Armed Forces prosecution of the war effort or to promote the success of the country's enemies. It was then followed by the Sedition Act of 1918 as an extension of the Espionage Act. Going on to executive orders, normally hundreds of executive orders are made by each president. I chose 2 to talk about from the last 2 years of Donald Trump's presidency. The first being Executive Order 13925 on preventing online censorship. We live in a world today where online platforms are continuously growing. It raises important questions about applying the ideals of the First Amendment to modern communications and technology. Many Americans follow the news, stay in touch with friends and family, and share their views on current events through social media and other online platforms. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, just to name a few, hold immense power to shape the interpretation of public events, to censor, delete, or disappear information, and to control what people see or do not see. This executive order was to establish a stance that there should always be the opportunity for open debate and media platforms are not to censor based off of political bias. Another executive order is 13864, which was for improving free inquiry, transparency, and accountability at colleges and universities, and focused on protecting students and encouraged them to have their own viewpoint. It was to enforce that all students were allowed to share and voice their opinions and feelings on their college campuses. This executive order was enforced after many conservative students were not heard on college campuses, as most colleges are said to have an unbalanced political view. Lastly, I want to finish off the presentation with a video that encompasses our civil liberty of free speech. We hope you enjoyed our video. Thank you.
The First Amendment gives Americans 5 basic freedoms: freedom of speech, press, petition, assembly, and religion. While all 5 are important, perhaps freedom of speech is talked about the most. Free speech is the cornerstone of our democracy. Although what you say can have consequences, like losing friends or a job, it gives Americans the right to express opinions without government censorship or control. And more importantly, you can't go to jail for expressing your opinion. It not only protects the speech that people like, but speech that people don't. Because when it comes to free speech, either everyone is protected or no one is at all. It allows citizens to support political movements and candidates. It gives people the power to call out government corruption and abuse. And most importantly, it empowers people to give unpopular opinions. The civil rights movement is a perfect example of free speech in action. During the 1950s and 60s, civil rights activists such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were able to use free speech as a tool to force change within society. By exercising their voice, civil rights activists were able to outlaw racial discrimination that plagued the nation. But in today's politically charged climate, some people believe the government should restrict certain speech. But thankfully, because of the First Amendment, everything from car commercials to fiery protests are protected.